Okay, our first speaker this afternoon is Kern, the magnificent Kern. He came to us from the USA a long time ago now and studied environmental management at Deakin University in Melbourne. In 1993, he set up Practical Ecology, which he owns and manages as an ecological consultancy, and he's a restoration contractor. He also runs another business doing offsets in rural Victoria. So, Lincoln, are you here? You're there. Excellent. We're off.
Thank you, Adrian. Can you all hear me well? Now, I'm going to give you a slightly different perspective today about, I'm going to focus on a couple very simple management points about grassland, but also I'll give you a perspective about rural grassland sites because I manage one, and that one of the key examples I'll be talking about will come from a rural grassland site that I manage. So my presentation overview, I'm going to talk about biomass and intertussock space and the importance of managing that. I will thank Josh Hodges for introducing it well, if not quickly, and use some examples about how I've used biomass monitoring and biomass management on a rural grassland site and on an urban grassland site in Laverton. So I think we've heard, I'm glad that the groundwork's been laid very effectively to talk about this principle that one of the key management activities of at least natural temperate grassland of the VVP is managing biomass. When the biomass gets too thick, it smothers the forbs in the intertussock spaces. So what's really important is to manage that biomass over time. Now, when we became aware of grasslands again and started doing research on them in the 90s, people like Morgan and Lunt published papers saying we should do this burn in every 2 to 5 years. The message I want to give today is do not do it based on time, measure it. Measure biomass. Have a monitoring framework, and then make decisions on real measurements of biomass in grasslands, not based on time. Now, so if you're going to manage biomass, you have a few different options. Prescribed burns is the first one I'll go into. To some degree, prescribed burns are hard. They're hard to do logistically. I personally believe in grassland and a lot of grassland sites, the difficulty of getting them done is perception rather than reality. Is the grassland burn, I did run a prescribed fire crew for 5 years. We burnt lots of grassland sites. Never had one get loose. Had to end the crew because I ran out of insurance. Now, but grassland burns are relatively easy. Blacken out, hardly required. There's no woody sticks and so on that keep burning, or stumps and so on usually. Sometimes there's rubbish, but that's another story. Now, on the other alternative is grazing, and we tend to stick to sheep grazing in practice. If you do a federal offset or a state offset, the offset management plan will talk about sheep grazing as a biomass management tool. I'll talk about that in a specific site. Now the third, I'll point out in this picture on the right, is is the site at Cressy that we manage. And you'll see that fence, and fencing is all important and how it's installed. So I don't have another picture of the fencing later, but we have an excellent fencing contractor who installed that fence without disturbing any grassland. Drove the star pickets in, didn't drive up and down the grassland, and we have a big wide gate that prevents all that mucking. If you've ever been on a farm, you know what happens on a gate is it gets all muddy because all the sheep have to go through that gate. So we've been making our gates bigger so we have less disturbance around those gates. Now let me introduce this site at Cressy by starting in the fire management strategy. But I will talk about offsets just briefly because we had a comment about this and the problem with offsets. And to me, they're necessary evil. I think good people should get the money that offsets produce and do good work, and every offset site is permanently protected. So this grassland is permanently protected now. I would also make the point that if you have less than 1 or 2% of an ecosystem, isn't that the logic of why almost no permit should be granted to clear that grassland? Because you can barely find an offset, even when you need one. And this is what we got to start keep telling government, is that when you have hardly any left, you need to avoid making the decision to clear it. To me, the problem with offsets, I've been in this game long enough that I remember before we had offsets, and politicians still chose to clear all the time, to do permits for clearing, but there was hardly any compensation. At least offsets create compensation, and we can talk about grasslands at least as why is any authority deciding to clear any when you can barely find when there's barely enough out there already and you can barely find an offset. Now, let me talk a little bit about, I've started with the grazing fire strategy because I wanted to demonstrate that even in offsets, you get you get the fire driven. So I've got two strategies up there. On this site, I'm not allowed, according to OMP, the Offset Management Plan, to have a burn more than 50 or 60 meters wide because there's a fear that striped-legged lizards will be eaten by birds. So that's why on the left there, I have those strips, and we've done a few of those strips and found that we can do those strips, basically do fire breaks down the edge and do long, narrow strips. On the right, the other strategy is when it's a bit wetter or we have islands of drier territory or wetter territory, and we've actually done a couple fires with both strategies. But we do find that it is quite hard to actually implement fire because the windows are really narrow and so on. So this slide is all the colors. Ignore the colors for the moment, or it might be useful. Those are just different offsets. This entire site's protected by different offsets. But this slide is about how we use sheep. We installed the yellow lines. This came with one paddock. We installed fencing to create 3 paddocks, and we put we put a bore with solar panels and a water trough at one end because we had a dam at the other end, and we've basically retrofitted this site so that we can graze it. And we want more than one paddock so that we can push those sheep to eat more in pulse grazing. But I've learned one thing about sheep: they don't do what you want them to do half the time. They're kind of like people. The other thing, it's always interesting having sheep on land because one always dies. If you have a flock, one always dies, and then the invertebrates eat that sheep, and then you get a spot with weeds because it's a pulse of nutrients. They also need minerals because they can't eat native grass without some attached nutrients. And what they also do, they love phalaris first. They will walk hundreds of meters by Themida and go straight for the phalaris, which is, I found, really interesting behavior, but that's what they do. Like again and again, we've learned on this site. So that's a story of our grazing strategy. And we graze sheep in this, it's a really good quality grassland. That's what I missed to say. But we graze sheep here because it's just much easier to implement, and it is likely to be more of the long-term management strategy that people beyond us will use. I should say, what I forgot to say about this site is it's just chock-a-block with endangered species. It's got over 3,000 spiny rice flower plants on it that we didn't even know they were there until we bought it and found them, and they're not even in the offsets because we didn't know till we started managing it, that we had them. So this site proves that there's a principle if you talk to people in the wider community, they'll talk about grasslands. Oh, they'll think, oh, grasses are rare. No, Themata is not a rare plant. Some of the forbs are rare. What's rare is grassland, native grassland. And often in native grass, this site demonstrates quite well that when you do have remnant native grassland that hasn't been de-rocked and has been respected more or less over the years, what you think is rare is actually quite common. So spiny rice flower is common here. We found growling grass frog. We've found, we have a good population of striped-legged lizard that's doing quite well according to monitoring. So yeah, it's grasslands that are rare, not the actual organisms. The organisms that are common in them are now rare, but it's because the sites are rare. Now, this is how we measure biomass. So my main message today, measure biomass. So here's the west end, and I'm sure you can't read the print, so I'll explain it. Is the red circles are where it's more than 40%, it's 20 to 40%, sorry, it's less than 20% of intertustic space. The green is when we have a higher percentage. So now this is the other half, and you can see the eastern half, we've either grazed it heavily with the sheep or whatever circumstances. We did learn through this monitoring round that the east end of the site needed less grazing, less biomass management than the west end. And I'll go back there to illustrate that. So we use this data to decide where to graze. So we figured out very quickly that with this data this is data from 21, but we repeat the data every year. And just for your information, it takes about a day to record this data. Thank you, 2 minutes. And what we do with this data is make decisions about where to do intensive grazing, to push the grazing or push the fire. So that's one site that we do it on with, and you can see on, so with this data, we kind of use it like a heat map. It's 140 points, and it takes about a day each year to measure it, and then we inform decisions about grazing and biomass management from that. Now, this is another site we do. This is at Williams Landing in Laverton. This is one of 3 grassland reserves, and I show you this because the blue bits are where we measure biomass here. And we've managed this site since 2003, and 3 sites. I haven't shown you all 3. But we measure biomass every year, and then we make decisions about that about burning. We figure out what's the highest priority space with higher levels of biomass, and that becomes the priority sites for burning. What we also do, so in the same space, in the same reserves is we do not just biomass management, but we also measure weed control. So here's a segue. This is weed control data. The green is in good nick, the yellow a little bit worse, and then the orange. And so this also guides fire work to some degree, fire where you put your fire, but also it guides where you do your work, working from best to worst, but also understanding where your good quality grassland is. Now, the last point I want to make about this, I've formed a view that you need to link fire, which you might use, or grazing for biomass management, always link it to weeds, to weed management. And we kind of have, it's actually quite convenient, is if you only do weed control after fire, because you've created green pick, you enhance your ability to utterly minimize non-target damage. And that's what's really important. Now, with the 2 to 5 year cycle, or with a regular burn cycle, and you burn essentially when you have enough fuel, this is different to a lot of other ecosystems. I want to say a note of caution here, because what can happen is, when it comes to bushfire, is lots of people say, oh, all native vegetation burns. And so we can use fire across all native vegetation. Well, you can't use fire the same way, so across all native vegetation. Grasslands love a good fire, but heathland only likes a good fire every 50 years or so. Mountain ash forest only likes a good fire every few hundred years. So when we are talking about burning grasslands more, we need to always remind ourselves and other people, the wider community, that this ecosystem loves fire, but a lot of other ecosystems only like occasional fire. So I'm flowing to the point basically, and I'll conclude, thanks Yasmin, in saying measure biomass on an ongoing basis, make decisions for biomass management based on that monitoring, and link, to me, it's convenient and also it is a good basic principle. Set up a burning framework or biomass management framework on your grassland site, and always bring in weed control immediately after that biomass reduction, that biomass management. I'll leave it there.
We've got some momentum here, and it's just great to see so much grassy action and grassy love in one place.
I just think it was such a great mix.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Fantastic, and that's it.